Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're getting into something I think we've all run into at some point, toxic behavior. But we're going to go way beyond just throwing labels around. We're going to look at the patterns, the psychology behind it all, and, this is the important part, how to actually break the cycle. All right, let's get into it.
So let me start with this question. It's simple, right? But it totally gets to the heart of the issue. This was actually the top comment in a huge online discussion on this topic. And that feeling, that emotional exhaustion, it's a massive clue that something is off in a relationship or a dynamic. It's usually the very first sign that you might be dealing with some pretty harmful behaviors.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, we'll talk about spotting those red flags. Then, we'll dive into two big psychological drivers, the victim mentality and the need for control. And finally, we'll zoom out a bit and talk about some real practical solutions.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What exactly are we supposed to be looking for? This first part is all about recognizing those signs you can actually see, the specific things people do and say that can cause so much damage.
This quote from a Reddit user just nails the experience, doesn't it? It points to that core pattern. There's always a new villain in their story. They absolutely refuse to take any blame. And then, and this is the really maddening part, they flip it around and make your reaction to what they did the bigger problem.
And that brings us to a really important distinction that psychologists make. The goal here isn't to slap a permanent toxic label on a person. No, the focus should be on identifying specific harmful behaviors. And that's a much more hopeful way to look at it, you know? Because behaviors can be understood, and maybe, just maybe, they can be changed.
Okay, so let's get specific. Here are 5 classic behaviors to watch out for. First, that constant need to control situations and people. Second, they use gossip as a weapon, really, to feel powerful. Third, lying just isn't a big deal to them. It's just a tool to get what they want. Fourth, their sense of humor is basically just sarcasm, which, let's be honest, is often just anger with a flimsy disguise. And last, they just seem to be in constant attack mode, always ready for a fight over the smallest things.
So we've seen the what, but now let's dig into the why. What's driving all this? Well, one of the biggest forces at play is something psychologists call a victim mentality.
This definition from WebMD really lays it out. Notice that it's a learned behavior. It's this worldview where life is just something that happens to you. It's never your doing. It's always someone else's fault, or it's the system, or just plain bad luck that's behind all your problems. Now, people sometimes mix this up with a martyr complex, but they're not the same thing. Someone with a victim mentality feels passive, like they're just a target for bad luck. But a person with a martyr complex, they're active. They'll take on the extra work, they'll make the big sacrifice, and then they'll feel super resentful that nobody appreciates the burden they chose to carry. See the difference?
It honestly sounds exhausting and, well, pretty disempowering. So why would anyone fall into this way of thinking? Well, believe it or not, there are some hidden benefits, or what therapists sometimes call secondary gains. Let's unpack that. First off, if nothing is ever your fault, you never have to be responsible for anything. That feels safe, right? Second, it's a pretty effective way to get sympathy and attention. Third, it can feed a deep, unconscious need for validation that might go way back to childhood trauma. And finally, if you can always blame failure on something or someone else, you never really have to take any big risks.
This pattern of blame often goes hand in hand with our next big psychological driver, a deep, intense need for control. This is a huge piece of the puzzle, and it often shows up as manipulation and is linked to narcissistic traits.
Psychology Today puts this perfectly. Manipulation isn't just about trying to get your way. It's about controlling the entire story, twisting reality so you come out on top, and making sure you never, ever have to admit you were wrong. It is, fundamentally, a form of emotional abuse. Now, when these patterns are really extreme and long-lasting, they can be part of an actual clinical diagnosis. This is the official list from the DSM-5 for narcissistic personality disorder. A person has to have at least 5 of these traits, things like a huge sense of self-importance, a total lack of empathy, and feeling entitled to whatever they want. This quote went viral for a reason. It is a brilliant, step-by-step summary of how narcissistic deflection works. You could just see the logic unfold, first deny, then minimize, then shift the blame, until finally the person who was hurt is told they actually deserved it. It is just a chillingly perfect breakdown.
But here's the thing you have to understand. all that arrogance is usually just a defense. Researchers now think that at the heart of pathological narcissism isn't a big ego, but the exact opposite, something called narcissistic vulnerability. It's an incredibly fragile sense of self that desperately needs constant praise from the outside. The grandiosity, it's just a mask for deep, deep insecurity.
All right, so we've deconstructed these behaviors. Now let's zoom out and see how outside pressures can make them even worse, because major stress can create the perfect environment for these patterns to grow. And then we'll talk about how you can actually start to break the cycle.
Let's just take one huge life stressor, unemployment. That number 1 in 5, that's the portion of people around the world who will face it at some point. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because the sheer stress of something like this can be a massive trigger for the very behaviors we've been talking about.
And this is why those external factors matter so much. Losing a job doesn't just hurt your wallet. It can create a perfect storm of anxiety, pressure, and a loss of identity. And that storm can feed right into these negative psychological patterns. It really shows how any of us can be vulnerable to these mindsets when we're under that much stress.
Okay, so recognizing these patterns in other people, or maybe even in yourself, is a huge first step. But what do you actually do about it? How do you move from feeling helpless to feeling empowered again?
Well, experts suggest it comes down to 3 key steps. First, take responsibility. This is the direct cure for that victim mentality. It's not about blaming yourself, it's about remembering you have agency in your own life. Second, practice self-care and self-compassion. Understand these patterns are often old coping mechanisms, and healing from them requires being kind to yourself. And third, something super practical. Start saying no. Start setting boundaries.
And self-care isn't just a buzzword, right? It's about doing real things. The basics, like exercise, healthy food, and enough sleep, that's the foundation for your mental energy. Setting tiny, achievable goals can rebuild that sense of accomplishment. Even simple stuff like changing up your workspace or finding stories that inspire you can help break that negative loop. So we've gone from spotting the red flags to understanding the psychology and all the way to finding a path forward. Understanding all this is a massive first step. So the only real question left is, what's your next one going to be? Thanks for watching The Explainer.